The 4 decades of rock on 106.1 Rock Radio. All this week, the 90s. Grunge gets rid of glam, the boys from Burnage make it big, and the biggest band in the world was the Rolling Stones. Again. Today, the technology.
The rise of the MP3. Do you remember receiving your first MP3 file or sending your first MP3 file? When would that have been?
Yeah, late 90s. 98, 99. I may have been a late adopter.
I think you might have been. I think you might be a lot younger than I think you are, Sam. Because I've got it down here that MP3 started flitting about the place in the mid-90s. And then, of course, you've got 97, 98, stuff like Napster comes along, file-sharing websites that allow people to... I mean, they use the word share, but it's still not a better word, as Lars Ulrich might perhaps put it.
Yes, I mean... this is a thorny debate, isn't it? I mean, I think it's certainly true to say that for every success story that's happened because of file sharing and MP3s, there's 100, 1,000 bands who've lost out. And it's become incredibly difficult to be a professional musician and make a living because it's so easy for people to give away what you've produced.
And of course, the means of sharing music by digital files means that the way of listening to music changed radically, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's more than anything probably down to the iPod and its little button that said shuffle.
Was the iPod 2001, but there were MP3 players about in the 90s, weren't there?
There were certainly software ones on the computers. Oh, there must have been some hardware ones as well, yeah.
I can't imagine that bands took too much notice of that because it all happened too quickly. I can't imagine that they were in the studio thinking, people are going to listen to this on a home PC, on those piddling little computers. There's no point of spending hundreds and thousands of hours and hundreds of thousands of pounds. We might as well do what the Beatles did back in the 60s, stick the vocals right at the front so that people actually notice our music.
Well, you do actually get a very similar phenomenon in the 90s, except that it's not to do with the vocals, it's to do with what's called Brick Wall Limited. And arguably the first album to do this, I think, was Oasis's What's the Story, Morning Glory.
I do like it when he uses jargon, Miss Rachel. What was that again, Sam? Brick Wall Limiting?
It's a technique that you can use because on a CD, unlike a vinyl, there is a fixed limit to how loud you can make anything. And the thinking went that if I can make this CD louder than that CD, it will stand out more. When it's played on the radio, people will notice the song more, we'll sell more CDs. Well, it seemed to work for Oasis. And since then, there's been a steady escalation in people making their CDs louder and louder and louder.
I was going to say, have you heard Death Magnetic by Metallica?
Exactly. That's celebrated as possibly the worst example of this. And it's obviously distorted when you listen to it, and not in the kind of way that heavy metal ought to be distorted.
What about live music in the 90s? How does that change? Bands, are they more able to reproduce the sound on record because the technology aids them, or are they restricted by the fact that the technology makes the recorded music so complex it's virtually impossible to reproduce live, and really, they're not actually playing live, are they?
There's a huge slump in live music at the end of the 80s and the early 90s, partly because of dance music.
Wash your mouth out, Sam.
Slowly in the 90s, that comes back, and with Britpop, you get a revival of live music. And for a lot of people, it's a kind of back to basics thing, in the same way that those bands all look back to the Kinks and the Beatles as their inspirations. They look back to the idea of like, well, we're just going to be 4 blokes playing guitars in a pub, and that's going to be our live music. And in a sense, I think that brought a breath of fresh air back to the whole live scene.